All right, so again, welcome everyone. Today we are covering part one of our Summary Across Trials introduction. So we'll try to cover kind of each, the most basics of each phase of the ST. Then we'll kind of flesh out those ideas more in next week's session to have some more examples. But we'll try to get through everything at the most basic level today. And just a couple of slides for us to kind of reference as we go along. But first, I guess first I'll switch back to ARM just to introduce the program itself. So today we're talking about Summary Across Trials, which is an add-in to ARM. So it's not a feature that's available in just every single ARM license. Instead, it's an additional component that you can purchase and add on to a license. And so there's no special installation for it. You'll actually find it just within your ARM. So here I'm on kind of the home screen study list in ARM. And if you have the ST on your license, then you can toggle over to that side of things, either through the file menu. There's the shortcut to switch to Summary Across Trials, or also on the navigation bar here to the left. We're kind of under ARM already, then there's the Summary Across Trials. And just clicking on that, you'll see a little splash screen, kind of show, hey, we're switching things over, and now we are within ST. So within ST, really what we're doing is creating a criteria file. And to kind of explain what that is, it's basically a question, or maybe a more technical term would be a query that we're going to create within ST. And that question really has three components that we're going to cover and talk about how to create. And we're selecting a set of trials that we want to search. Then we're going to specify what treatments do we want to include? What treatments do we care about that we want to summarize and compare against each other? And then finally, what columns of data? We've got all the data assessments in the trials that we've selected. Which of those do we care about, and how do we want to combine them and analyze those? So that's kind of our roadmap today, basically, is those three sections. And that really builds at least the most basic core of ST. Again, building this question or this query within the program. So when I first open ST, there's the little introduction window here. And if you have that, it shows recent ones you've worked on, or you can start a new criteria. Sometimes if you've already cleared off so you don't see that, you might just be brought right to a blank screen. Either one will work. And we can also go up to the file menu and there's new criteria. And that's really how we would get started, much like we do in ARM with a new protocol. But here we're creating that criteria. So when we start, it actually is going to look a lot like a new protocol process at the very beginning, because we need to define the study definition, or really the template, the structure for our criteria. So of course, we'll choose the standard templates, and you really want to match whatever selection that you made with all of your trials that you're going to summarize, which 98% of the time I think would be your G-all-7 for the multidiscipline. On occasion, if you're working with seed variety studies and they specifically were created with the G-seed, then you would want to choose that for your criteria. But as I said, in almost all cases, we'd be working with the G-all. Okay, so then we are brought to the new criteria settings, and we see kind of our first main component here of our criteria, selecting the trials to search. So we have a couple of different options. First of all, we can select trials from our main computer. And whether it's on our local hard drive is where we've been saving our trials, or if you're sharing files through like Dropbox or OneDrive, or a network location, any files that your computer can find would be this first option here. We're selecting trials to search. And if we select that, we'll see the study list pop up and we can find our files. There's also an option if your company uses the ATD database. That's a database that we provide that will house your trials, a great kind of central repository for the company. You can also integrate with that, and you would click on this option here, and clicking this button will bring up, it's a study list, but it's actually showing the files in the company database within your company. So it's really the same process as far as everything else we're going to see today, wherever you're pulling those files from. But here today, I'll choose trials from my computer. And so when I click on this button, then we'll actually get the opportunity to select files. So as I said, the study list comes up. If you're not familiar with this tool, it's actually something we saw in ARM. Really what the study list is a list of all of the trials and protocols that you've worked on within ARM. And it's a real nice tool to be able to find and filter and search across all of your files. So this bottom portion is those list of trials. Right now, it's filtered to only show me my trials because we're in ST. So all of the trials that I've worked on here are in this list, and there's a lot of different pieces of information that we've indexed to be able to search across, essentially. And so this top portion here is a list of filters. So just depending on how you'd want to narrow it down, something like trial year, you click this little gold box and it will show you all of the unique values within the trials that you have down below. So I can see all the different years of my trials. And actually today I'm running from the tutorial study list. So these are just example files that are included in all of the installations. So if you even wanted to follow along or use these same files, everyone has them. You just click that tutorial box at the bottom and it'll switch over. Instead of showing your files, it'll show these example files within ARM. So something like coming back to my trial year, then I could choose a specific, I only want to work on files from this year. You could select that and click OK. And it'll filter down to only the trials that had a trial year of 2022. And since these are the example files, they're not a surprise, there's not terribly many of those. You can filter on all of those different fields. As you can see, there's a lot of different things that you can utilize to search and filter down to find the list of trials that you want. So for me, I'm just going to type in a study ID and do a contains search. We have a list of example files for ST. They work very nicely for an introduction like this. So I'm just going to filter. This gives me the list of only the trials that contained that text within the study ID, which made it very easy for me to find. And then we're just making a selection of which trials we want to include. So now when I click OK, you'll see we've updated. There's a 6 in parentheses behind the trials to search text. So that's a visual reminder that we have chosen a set of files. And in our case, we only have 6 of them that we've selected. Moving to the next screen, one more set of settings. Not a whole lot going on here, though, as far as ST is concerned. I think the one interest would be your treatment units, just which system you typically work in. ARM and ST are both really good at converting between unit systems. So, when we get into the treatment section and thinking about, how are we going to combine treatments across different trials? If you were concerned, well, some of these trials might be in US standard and some were done in metric, ARM's really good at converting. If it's the same true rate, ST will just know when it looks at those individual trials, which ones are equivalent. So here, the selection is really just what you want to see on the editor. And ST will figure out in the background for the individual trials. So I'll stick with metric for this example. And now when we click next, we are actually kind of creating this criteria. And so before we address this window, you'll just see that we've loaded a criteria. We haven't named it yet, but it is a criteria file. And it's actually going to look a lot like an ARM trial. So there'll obviously be some key differences, but it'll be very, very similar in structure to what you're used to in ARM. So in addition to kind of setting up this criteria, now we are brought to the treatments editor. And there's a question for us of where is the treatment information that we're wanting to look at? And really what ST is offering to do here is to open up all 6 of our trials that we've selected and build a list of all the unique treatments that are in those different trials. And that's really a great starting point, I think. Definitely for a beginner, but even anyone who's kind of used to ST, I think still can kind of benefit from using this. We call it the build treatments function. It really just gives you a good look at what you're dealing with in those trials. And maybe all of your trials came from the same protocol. They all have the same treatment list. It's really nice and clean. That's great. This will be really easy. But sometimes if you have multiple sources, some trials didn't use your protocol or whatever, things can be a little bit messier. We've got a lot of tools in ST for overcoming some of those challenges. Probably won't cover a whole lot of them today, but we'll try to see a couple examples across our 2 sessions. But I think this build treatments gives us a look at what we're dealing with, how messy things are, and what we need to do to kind of get things ready for summarization. So we're gonna say next year to run that build treatments functionality. If we wanted to, we could have chosen a protocol or a trial, and ST would have basically just copied in the whole treatment list. And that would have been our starting point. But let's do the build treatments. And ST has one question for us before it builds that list of treatments. And it's really, how should we determine what is a unique treatment? So we can select the columns from the treatment editor that we should care about. So for example, treatment name, probably the most obvious one. If we called it something different, in most cases, it's a different product. So we want to match on that treatment name to say if it's a different name, it's a different product. The other field chosen by default is the rate and the rate unit. So for example, if you had a product that you were studying, and maybe you applied it at 3 different rates, low, medium, and high. Kind of wanted to see what works best, what's the best balance of application rate. And so in that situation, if we want to make sure to summarize all 3 of those levels differently, then ST needs to count rate in the rate unit as a unique field. So we know and we have those separated out. On the other side, if we had our products and maybe the rate varied a little bit, just depending on its location, but we don't really care for this summary. That's not really part of our objective. We could certainly turn these off. And now ST wouldn't even look at the rate value at all, and it would just combine all of the treatments that have the same treatment name together. And we don't care at what rate it was applied to. So really depends on your objective, depends on your studies. But by default, we have that rate on. And in my example today, I will want to use that. So those are the 2 on by default. You certainly could use others as well. If your formulation concentration really mattered, you could do the same thing. You could turn that on as well. If that was part of your study, really any other column we could care about, and just have those be turned on or off. Again, this is just saying what should we care about when we are trying to figure out what treatments are unique. All right, so when we press next, we can confirm that we want to search all 6 of those trials, and it went really fast, but ST opened up all 6 of our trials and looked at the treatment list in each one of them and built our unique list. So we have a quick summary. It actually found 4 different treatments. They all came from the same trial, which tells me these actually were very nice and consistent. We didn't have too big of a mess at all. And when I click OK, now we have a treatment list, which is that unique list of treatments that it found in those studies. And I believe our example, these are like herbicide products. A couple of them have like adjuvants with them, and then of course an untreated check. So as I mentioned, there's tools within this editor that we could utilize. We'll kind of cover a couple scenarios in next week's session to get a little more complicated example. But right now, things went very well for us. We'll say that all of these trials came from the same protocol. It's very cut and dried. And we'll kind of leave it as that baseline list of treatments. But just know that this isn't an editor. We've kind of pre-filled it from our trials, but we could certainly change things if we wanted. So for example, sure, there's untreated checks in all of those trials, but maybe for our summary, we don't want to include them. That's fine. I could just right click and delete treatment 4. If we do that, we haven't changed any of the trials. We're not removing any data. We're just changing the question that we're going to ask. And so now even though there may be untreated plots in these trials, we just aren't going to include any of that data in our analysis. So that's kind of the power, in my mind at least, of this criteria, is that the changes we're making here are just changes to how we're going to ask our question. And so we have a lot of flexibility to tweak things here in ST because we're not moving data, we're not changing any data. We're just changing the way it will be combined for us later in the analysis. I'm just going to hand type that back in here. Not that it matters a whole lot for our example, but just to show, again, with that, this is kind of a live editor. You can change, you can hand fill things in if you want, and adjust things. Like I said, we'll go into that a little more detail, a little more, a few examples of messier situations next time around. The third component, now that we've selected our trials and we've got our treatments chosen, the third section that we really care about is found in the assessment data. So here I use the navigation bar, or just like in ARM, there's a window menu. You could switch over to the assessment data as well. And so this is really that third main component of a criteria. What should we do with the assessment columns? And so I have a quick slide just to talk about that portion of this criteria. And I like to kind of visualize this as if the assessment columns in all 6 of those trials that we've chosen are kind of like a deck of playing cards. So if you imagine, really each assessment rating that we have in those trials, they're all different assessment columns. Maybe each one of those is kind of like a card in that deck. And so we can provide instructions on what to do with those cards. For example, maybe I only want to see even numbers. So we could go through that deck and put all of the even numbers on the desk, and as soon as we find an odd number, we just throw it on the floor. We don't need it. I only want to see the even numbers. Then now we've got all the even numbers on the desk. Maybe I want to put them into piles. So maybe we'll group them or sort them into colors. So in one stack, all of the red even numbers, and then all of the black even numbers. And again, all of the odds were just on the floor. So that you can kind of do those different commands to sort out and group the cards. And that's really kind of what we're doing in ST. Instead of playing cards, it's data columns. And our analysis, we are trying to combine those assessments from all those trials. So that's the grouping and combining into our grand means that we'll see and be able to run comparisons on that combined data. So we'll kind of show then these functions in ST that match up with that scenario. So back in ST, I've got my assessment column here. There's a bunch of symbols that you see when we clicked into this first column, and we'll kind of explain each of those. But starting with maybe the most basic example, let's look at rating type. And kind of like when we did with our cards to say, I only want red cards, we can be very specific to only take a certain type of assessment column. So when I click into rating type, you can see we have a gold box, just like we saw in the study list. And that really is a similar function. We're going to filter and specify what we care about. So here in this list, I've got 4 different rating types. These correspond to all of the unique rating types in all of the assessment columns in our 6 trials. So I could choose, maybe I want to look at our control ratings in those assessment columns in the trials. So I can choose control and click OK. So this is telling ST, ignore all of those yield columns, all the moisture content columns, ignore anything that doesn't have control as the rating type. And we could specify maybe the rating unit as well, just to make sure if we had calculated columns. And you can see in my filter box here, I have a % and a % UNCK, which is percent of untreated check. So maybe it might have potential for 2 different types of assessments. And so if we didn't do anything with the rating unit, we might be combining two different types of data. So a lot like when you're in a trial and we talk about, how to, what are the most important fields for describing a column, those same fields matter a lot here in ST to make sure we aren't combining too much or not enough of our data. So here with the rating unit, if we were confident that maybe there was just two different ways that our trialist filled in the column, and there weren't any calculations, and we just know that both of these would be valid. It was just two different ways people filled it in. You can select more than one. When you click OK, now this will take any columns that have % or %UNCK as the rating unit, assuming, again, that those columns are control columns. So as we add more, use more lines, kind of narrow things down farther, we really will be stacking those on top. So we'll continue to get more and more narrow, essentially, of all of those columns that we're dealing with. So that's kind of the first type. We won't dive too deep into these others at the moment, but I think it's good to maybe just mention what these other wildcards will do. The asterisk here in like assessed by and data entry date, that actually does nothing. It's really the take everything wildcard. So we're really specifying that we don't care what number of subsamples was entered. We don't care who assessed the column. We're not specifying anything. We're not sorting anything. Just ignore that column. We don't need to match on anything that's there. So you may have an asterisk. If you leave it blank, it'll be the same thing. So whether you put in an asterisk or blank, it's going to give all. There you go. When you see it's blank, ARM or ST kind of fills in the word all, just to explain. Bring it all. It doesn't matter what's in there. There's no need to filter based on this field. The other wildcard is this @ symbol, and it's the match and separate wildcard. So that one really will create our groups for us. And I think right now, just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to delete those out. And we will come back and do an example with those after we've kind of seen the results. I think it's a lot easier to demonstrate that once we've seen what we get before utilizing that. Otherwise, it's kind of hard to compare. Oh, and my mouse is like frozen for a moment. There we go. I think we're back. Okay, so we will come back to that match and separate wildcard. We'll just have a very simple example here. Give me all of the assessment columns that are control ratings, and whether it's % or % of untreated check, those are both should be treated the same. So that is basically our instruction for the assessment portion of this criteria. So before we see the analysis, it might be good for us to save what we've accomplished so far. And so we can go up to File and Save. And so what we're going to do, as we kind of mentioned when we started, is we're saving a criteria file. This is really just the question we're about to ask. So everything we've accomplished so far today, picking treatments, picking trials, picking the assessment, that's really what we're saving. There is no data that's being saved in this criteria. It's just the question. So for the file name, I usually recommend basically having the question be the name of your criteria. And so what I mean by that would be to describe, what are you trying to accomplish? What's this goal that we've been working towards, and give that a name. So, in my example, it's the ST exam trials for, I don't even know what year this was, but probably your year. And I think Super Stomp was maybe that's really the product that's ours that we really care about. And of course, then we were doing control ratings. Whatever it is that you're really trying to find out makes a lot of sense to have as the name of the criteria. And that way we can always come back to this and rerun it. So, maybe right now we've got 80% of our trials in. We're still waiting for some more data to come in, but I kind of want to get a feel for what's happening. I can create this criteria, look at some of the data. Then I could come back in a week. Okay, now we've got all the trials. They're all uploaded to the database, or they're all out there on our network. I can come right back to this criteria, maybe change my trials to search to grab those other 12 trials that came in, and just repeat the assessment or the summary and be able to look at the data. So that's kind of what we're doing here, trying to achieve by saving this criteria. And so, a nice descriptive name will help you remember, or maybe a colleague. If you have multiple people with ST, anyone can open this criteria within ST and run the analysis. So we'll say that's a good enough name for me. I'm just dropping it on my desktop, but you'd want to save it probably where your other trials are, or maybe a separate folder, depending on how you define that. There's a longer file description here. I think we've got long enough file names that it's not overly necessary, but if you wanted more information, you can put it here. And then within ST, if you go to open a criteria, ST can show you this description when you're clicking on certain criteria to remember which one you want. But now we've given this criteria a name. So as I said, we're kind of bookmarking what we've done up to this point, so we can always come back and rerun what we're about to do, which would be the analysis. So to run the analysis, under Tools menu at the top, we want to begin summary. And so we start with really kind of a nice overview of what we've done so far. We have 4 treatments defined in a criteria, 1 set of instructions, 1 column with instructions to deal with the data, data columns, and then we've got our 6 trials to search. So when I click OK, ST is going to open each of those trials and bring in the data and really, run that question essentially. So now we see some summary messages. It looks a little concerning because there's some errors. However, when I look at the first one, I can see it's talking about assumptions of AOV. And actually pretty much all of these do. So these are kind of carry over from the individual trials. If you were in one trial and running the AOV analysis, then we would maybe care about some of this. But really now that we're in ST, we're combining multiple trials. A lot of these kind of can be water under the bridge of sorts, because we're combining the data. We have a lot more data points, and So typically most of these kind of go away. So I think ideally, and I'm just looking at kind of each one of these just to make sure they all are talking about assumptions of AOV. So we can kind of gloss over those. Yep, and that was it. No other errors that we should be terribly concerned about. There is this information, and it tells us that all of our trials matched. And this overall here that we had 6 of them that we chose. Every single one of them matched, and we had 1 match column. Sometimes, depending on your data and your criteria, we might have some that do not match. And so whether it's because that trial didn't have any of the treatments that we defined in a criteria, or maybe they didn't have any assessment columns that matched what we chose, which in our case would be those control ratings. You know, if I had a trial that they didn't have any control ratings, then it would show up here in this list as not matching. But in our case, everything is nice and simple. So when I click OK, now we get to see the analysis portion here. So this is really a lot like the AOV report that we have in an ARM trial. So to the left, you have the individual treatments that we had defined in our criteria. The top portion is our assessment header, so describing the data. One key difference, this first column here has a slight blue shading compared to some of these white columns at the top. And so this blue one here is a grand mean column. So this is the combined data. This is kind of what we're here for in a sense. So we get a grand mean for each of our treatments. And we also have the mean separation as well. With those means, I've also got like a minimum, maximum, standard deviation. You can kind of control whether all of those show up or what you would want on the report. And then the count here tells us how many data points went into this grand mean. The columns to the right, they don't really have any shading. They have trial IDs at the top. So this would be the data columns from each of those trials. So, you know, if you took the grand mean of all of these, that's really what we have here in our grand mean column, is that combined mean. In our case, I see 41, which is a lot more than the 6 trials we had. So I actually know that these are composite columns. So within one trial, we actually have more than one assessment column that's being combined together to give us this mean, which then obviously this mean has all of those combined into it. So we might have cast maybe too broad of a net in a sense. We're combining a whole lot of data at once. And that's kind of, I think, the key in ST to get the question right. You don't want to blindly just, as soon as you have data here, we just run with it and say, this is perfect, this is what I need. I think a lot of dealing with ST is looking at what is being combined and making sure that it makes sense. Because the computer itself is kind of dumb in that sense that we told it to do something, it's going to go and do it. And then we need to decide, is that the right thing to do? Does it make sense that we're combining all 41 columns across just 6 trials? Is that really what we want to see? And that might not be the case. So getting to this point is great, but then there's a lot of maybe back and forth, which is part of what we'll get to flesh out and see some more examples here, including that match and separate wildcard, which I think an example like this is a perfect situation. There's so many columns from each trial. Maybe we need to understand what those are. What are the differences in those assessments? Because right now we only looked at the rating type and the percent, and that's all that we cared about. So we might need to dive in deeper. real quick before we do that, just to highlight some of the options here on this summary page. We have a button for options, and that's really how you can control kind of some of the things that are showing up on this screen here. So we actually have 3 different tabs of options really specific to the analysis and ST in general. But here, this first one comes up with the means. This is all the different components that are on the screen. So we could certainly, maybe we don't need the min-max standard deviation, or you want something else, the median instead. You can make changes to what is included on this report. The ST summary options here have more of the analysis related options. So like, what mean comparison test should we be running? What is our significance level? Things like that. And then that third tab is the formatting. So, how should the columns be sorted? Which assessment data headers are on the screen, and graphing as well. So those are the options. I made a couple changes, and so sometimes the screen will reload. Depending on what you've changed, it might have to rerun the data even. In our case, we just changed what's visible, and so it didn't have to reprocess the data at all. But we've condensed this down maybe and made it a little less noisy, perhaps. There is comments and a title that you can add, which will be in the report that we'll see in a moment. There's also a graphing function. So we saw on the options, we can include graphs in the report, and clicking on this button, we'll actually get to see the graphs themselves, kind of interact and change some of the options. We'll spend more time on that in the next session. That's kind of a quick summary of kind of what we have here. Actually, maybe I'll go next, since we've talked about those components, that when we press next, then it's going to generate a report for us based on kind of what we just saw on that screen. And include some of that is the graph. So right now it's asking how I should label the treatment fields. And then what field should we use for like the graph left title? I'll just do rating type. And the right title, I don't think I even need a right title, but so I'll maybe just leave that blank. So then we've kind of compiled a report based on that analysis. And we have that print dialog just like an ARM, which allows us to control some of the page settings. We can preview that report on the screen, which I will do real quick just to show. Maybe I'll zoom in a little, that we have that main dialog like we just saw, with the grand mean column and the individual assessments. That is really kind of the heart of this report. We do now get some of the statistics there as well for the grand mean and the individual trials. And this just extends on to several pages. And then we also have an AOV table for our grand mean column, as well as the individual assessments. Probably just the one thing to note here, of course, obviously you can dive in as far as your statistical experience will allow. But I think one of the most noteworthy items would be this treatment by trial interaction term. And so there's a p-value here that can be interesting just as you dive in deeper to decide, is there an interaction between the treatment performance that we saw up above and which the specific trials. Because if there is significant interaction, then we maybe can't totally trust this analysis here. Maybe we need to dive in a little further to take a closer look at that. And in our case, actually, there is quite a bit of significance So that would be something we might need to investigate, which hopefully we'll have time for a little bit in the next session, kind of tied to the graphing. We've got a real nice graph that kind of visualizes that interaction idea. So from this print, of course, we could send that report out to our printer. I think the nicest thing actually typically is to print to Excel. So it's kind of the exact opposite of ARM, where we say Excel kind of makes a mess of your report. PDF does really nice, nice job keeping the report the way you want it. In ST, it's kind of the opposite, just because we have so many columns, so much analysis, it doesn't really lend itself well to a narrow, skinny page on a piece of paper. But if you print to Excel, there is no width limit on the page. So Excel works really nicely because we just keep getting to move to the right. No matter how many columns we have, it just spits out that information. And so that actually works pretty nicely to get this information into another program with Excel here. So that actually is pretty handy in ST compared to some of the other reporting options. Okay. So I guess that's a quick run through of kind of from start to finish, the most basic example with ST. I think we've got a few more minutes, and we've kind of hinted at this. So I think I want to do one example to show that wild card with the assessment, because as we noted, this 41 is really high and should maybe be a cause for concern. And why do we have so many data columns being pulled into this one value, and maybe we're combining too much together. So kind of the main workflow really with ST, you'll find, I think, is once you get to that summary column, looking to see what got put together where, and then coming back to the criteria and changing things, and making small tweaks to fine tune the question in order to get it to be exactly what we want. So in this example, so we did our control ratings, and that seems fine. But maybe we want to figure out, what else could be going on. One option, we could certainly just open up another window of ARM and actually stay within ARM and maybe open up one of those trials and look at the assessment columns and see, all right, well, these control ratings, what's different? I've got all of these control ratings. Should they all be combined? Well, one example might be, there's different pests that are being encountered in each of these trials, depending on the location. Do we really want to blindly combine all of that data together? Or would it be a little more helpful to see how do these products do against one pest? And then in a separate section, combine how the products did with the second pest, and so on and so forth. And so that's really where that match and separate wildcard becomes very powerful. So using this @ symbol here, and I'm putting it in the pest code field. Again, that's really the instruction of put things in different groups. So any unique pest code that's found in all of our control ratings, I want to put in a different group. And I could do the same thing with pest name. Chances are that's going to be the exact same grouping because pest code and pest name are tied together. But that was kind of one of the defaults we saw when we created this column. It's a very, very common field that you would want to use this separate wildcard on. So putting that in, now we can just return to tools and begin summary. And we've just changed our question ever so slightly. And we're going to reprocess the data. We can ignore all those errors again, but I'd like to come back down and just do a quick check to see, did we lose anything? Or did we gain some things? Like I said, sometimes if not all the trials are matching, sometimes that's good to see. Did we become more inclusive or maybe less so? In our case, we still have everything matched. Things are pretty clean, but we do have 8 match columns now instead. As I click OK, we'll see that we really succeeded in using that match and separate. Now our first grand mean column is the control ratings for common lamb's quarter. So now we have a grand mean that has only 6 values, which looks pretty nice. We have 4 trials that had common lamb's quarter present in them. And so it looks like we are not combining nearly as much data, which I think in this case is probably better. So previously we were just blindly combining any weed at all and putting it all together in one huge grand mean, which doesn't really tell us anything. But now we can feel pretty good that we're actually having a look at how our products are performing against common lamb's quarter in our 6 trials here. And as I move to the right, now I have a new grand mean column, column number 2 here. Same control ratings, but with barnyard grass. So we can kind of get a glimpse of which trials had barnyard grass present. And we have a grand mean with 8 data points. So it looks like between those 4 columns, there must be about 2 assessment timings for each of those trials, all combined together to give us a grand mean. And you can see we just kind of continue the process. Again, now we have annual mercury, large crabgrass. So you can see now that we've made a different group for each different pest that we have. And some of them didn't find a whole lot. So, pigweed, we only had 1 trial that had that present. So maybe that doesn't do us a lot of good, just not enough. Same thing for the lady's thumb. But hopefully that kind of illustrates what that match and separate will do. And in this case, I think really helped us to break apart all of those different columns into something that actually makes sense for us. And that, I think, is the biggest takeaway from this phase of the ST, is to not just blindly accept the summary that you get. Hey, it gave us something, that must be what we want. But instead, it's kind of a back and forth to cultivate that question we're asking and make this criteria give us, what makes sense. Okay, well, that is really everything we have time for at this point. Hopefully, you'll be able to join us next week, or at least that you're registered, so we can send you the recording. In part 2, we're really just going to take this example farther. So we'll do a quick recap, but then just kind of talk through some more features to dive in a little deeper. I'm going to make our treatments a little messier than what we had here, so we can talk about some of the treatment tools to combine those when they don't match as nicely. So we'll get to see some wildcards in the treatment editor. We'll get some more examples with the assessments as well, and take a closer look at those graphs and that interaction term and how we might be able to fiddle around with that just a little bit. So thanks everybody for joining us, and hopefully we'll be seeing you again next week too. Oh, and I do have a question. So yeah, definitely if there's any questions, have a couple minutes. The first one with the letter tests. So we're right on the right page here. So you'll notice we have the summary column, but we also are including the individual trials as well. And those are the means and the mean separation tests. If you're looking at this, and you also have your report printout from ST Exam 1, you might be asking, wait a minute, I don't see the exact same thing. Maybe the letters are different, maybe even the means are different. A couple of possibilities. Number one, kind of our example here with the barnyard grass. We had a count of 8. So that told me that there was actually 2 different assessments, 2 different control assessments from ST Exam 1 that were matched. So, one possibility is maybe we're combining multiple columns together from that same trial. So the means might not even match. And that composite term up here kind of tells me that there's more than one that are combined. The other option would be the statistical parameters. What we're using here in the stats would actually be, if I cancel here, would be under the file print reports. There's your options here. So it would be running, it kind of basically runs an AOV means table in the background to do the stats for the individual trials. So if there were any differences in, changes in your options, that might be another source as to why it might not match. The other thing I could think of would also be maybe the missing data. If you've got some missing data points, ST is going to do things a little different. I don't know if that would make a difference in the stats or not. I'd probably have to kind of dive into a specific example if you did have a set of trials that were giving you problems. We could always kind of dive in and take a look. But those, I think the first 2 options would be your most likely. Either your report options are different. Just double check those while you're in ST, and also if you have multiple trials being combined. But good question. All right. Well, thank you everyone again for joining, and hopefully we'll be joining together again soon.